It was December 1941, and the Atlantic Ocean was dying. Not in the way that poets describe death, quietly, slowly, peacefully. No, the Atlantic was dying the way a battlefield dies, loudly, violently, and without mercy. Merchant ships, the great floating arteries that carried food, fuel, weapons, and hope from the shores of America to the embattled coasts of Britain, were being torn apart in the night. One by one, week by week, they vanished beneath the cold black water. The men who sailed them were not soldiers. Many of them were ordinary men, dock workers, fishermen, fathers, young men from small towns who had never seen an ocean before they were asked to cross one. And they were dying at a rate that no newspaper in America was allowed to fully print, because the truth was simply too devastating to publish. In the early months of 1942, German U-boats, the sleek, silent, terrifying submarines that Admiral Karl Donitz had spent years perfecting, were hunting along the American coastline with a freedom that bordered on arrogance. Donitz called it Operation Drumbeat, but the U-boat crews had their own name for it. They called it the Happy Time. And it was. For them. American cities along the eastern seaboard had refused to enforce blackout regulations, and so the lights of New York, Miami, and Jacksonville blazed across the night sky, silhouetting every Allied merchant ship against the glow-like targets painted on a shooting range. German submarine commanders would surface their vessels offshore and watch through their periscopes with something approaching disbelief. The Americans, somehow, had not yet understood that the war had come to their doorstep. In those first 6 months of 1942 alone, the U-boats sank nearly 400 ships in American waters. Almost 400 vessels. Millions of tons of desperately needed supplies. Thousands of men lost. The ocean floor along the American East Coast became a graveyard so vast that fishermen would later tell their grandchildren they had pulled up pieces of wreckage for years afterward, long after the war was over, long after the world had tried to forget. In Washington, D.C., inside the offices of the Navy Department, a man named Ernest King sat behind a desk that was perpetually buried under reports he read with the concentration of a surgeon and the fury of a general. Admiral Ernest J. King was not a man who inspired warmth. His own daughter had once reportedly said that he was the most even-tempered man she knew. He was always in a rage. He was demanding, difficult, deeply stubborn, and profoundly brilliant. He had spent his entire career being underestimated by men who mistook his coldness for stupidity and his silence for agreement. They had learned, often painfully, that he was neither stupid nor agreeable. Ernest King looked at the U-boat reports spreading across his desk in the winter of 1942, and he felt something that he would never admit to feeling in public: fear. Not for himself, for the war. Because the mathematics were not working in America's favor, and Ernest King understood mathematics with a clarity that most men could not manage in a quiet room, let alone in the middle of a global catastrophe. The problem was not courage. The American sailors had courage to spare. The problem was not effort. The American Navy was working around the clock, every day, in every port. The problem was something far more humbling: they simply did not yet know how to fight this war. The U-boat campaign was unlike anything the American military had trained for. These were not battleships charging across open water. These were shadows. These were invisible killers moving silently through the dark, striking without warning, disappearing before a response could be mounted, and leaving behind nothing but burning wreckage and men screaming in oil-slicked water. The American Navy had depth charges, but they needed to find the submarines first. They had aircraft, but the patrol routes were disorganized. They had convoys, groups of merchant ships traveling together for protection, but the convoy system was being implemented too slowly, too inconsistently, and with too little coordination to stop the bleeding. And the bleeding was extraordinary. In a small town in Ohio, a woman named Margaret received a telegram on a Tuesday morning in March 1942. She was 31 years old, and she had been married for 4 years to a merchant sailor named Thomas, who had gentle hands and a habit of whistling while he made breakfast. The telegram told her that Thomas's ship had been torpedoed in the Atlantic and that his body had not been recovered. Margaret read the telegram 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table while the coffee she had made that morning grew cold beside her. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her apron, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street where her neighbor's children were playing in the morning sunlight. She stood there for a very long time. She did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply stood there, absorbing it, the way the earth absorbs rain, completely, and without anywhere else for it to go. Margaret's story was not unique. Across America, across Britain, across every nation touched by the Atlantic War, there were women at windows and parents at kitchen tables and children who would grow up asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Every ship that sank was not just steel and cargo. It was somebody's husband, somebody's son, somebody's father who had promised he would come home. And in his underground headquarters in Lorient, France, the enormous fortified submarine base from which his U-boats departed like sharks released into the ocean, Admiral Karl Donitz was watching the tonnage reports with deep, quiet satisfaction. Donitz was a man of singular focus. He had dedicated his professional life to one idea, that Germany could win the war by strangling Britain's supply lines, by sinking enough Allied shipping to make the war economically and logistically impossible to continue. His theory was elegant in its brutality. Britain was an island nation. An island nation lives and dies by what the sea brings to its shores. Cut the sea routes, sink the ships, starve the supply chain, and Britain would have to surrender. And if Britain fell, the Americans would have no base from which to launch a counterattack against occupied Europe. The strategy was sound. In the winter of 1942, it was working. But Donitz had made an error. Not a tactical error. Not a strategic error. He had made the deepest kind of error that any commander can make. He had underestimated what his enemy was willing to become. Because while the U-boats were hunting in the Atlantic night, and while Ernest King was furiously reorganizing the American naval response, something else was happening in the shipyards of Baltimore, Boston, Philadelphia, and Newport News. Something extraordinary. Something that the Germans, for all their intelligence and all their confidence, had failed to fully account for. America was building, not slowly, not carefully, not at the measured pace of a nation preparing for a long war. America was building with the frantic, almost irrational energy of a country that had been hit in the face and was throwing everything it had into its response before the shock could settle into defeat. The shipyards were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers who had never welded a hull in their lives were being trained in weeks and sent to work alongside. Veterans who had spent their careers in the yards. Women who had spent their mornings making breakfast and their afternoons raising children were tying back their hair, pulling on overalls, and picking up welding torches. The sound of the yards was constant, a roaring, grinding, clanging symphony of industry that rose into the night sky and fell like music over the surrounding neighborhoods, and the people in those neighborhoods learned to sleep through it the way you learn to sleep through a sound that means safety rather than danger. Henry Kaiser was not a military man. He was a shipbuilder. He was, by most traditional measures, an outsider to the world of naval construction. His critics said he cut corners, moved too fast, built ships that traditionalists doubted would hold together in rough seas. Henry Kaiser did not particularly care what his critics said. He had developed a technique of prefabricated shipbuilding, constructing the sections of a ship in separate locations and then assembling them on the slipway like a massive, floating puzzle, that was reducing the time required to build a Liberty ship from the industry standard of several months to something that seemed, at first, frankly impossible. His yards at Richmond, California, would eventually launch a fully assembled Liberty ship in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. A ship that would have taken a year to build before the war. His critics went very quiet after that. But ships alone could not win the Atlantic. Ships needed captains. Captains needed tactics. And tactics needed intelligence, the cold, precise, devastating kind of intelligence that tells you not just where the enemy is, but why he is there, and what he plans to do next. And here, in the winter and spring of 1942, a quiet revolution was beginning in a place that most people had never heard of and would not hear of for decades afterward. It was happening in a country house in the English countryside. A place called Bletchley Park. Inside the converted mansion and its surrounding huts, surrounded by teacups and eccentrics and an atmosphere of intense, almost unbearable mental pressure, a group of mathematicians, linguists, crossword enthusiasts, chess champions, and code breakers were doing something that the German high command believed to be categorically impossible. They were reading the enemy's mail. The Germans communicated their U-boat positions, their movements, their patrol routes, and their tactical orders through a system they called Enigma, an encryption machine that generated codes so complex, with so many possible combinations, that the German Navy was absolutely certain that Allied forces could never break them. The German confidence in Enigma was not arrogance. It was mathematics. The number of possible Enigma settings was so astronomically large that breaking the code by trial and error would, by any reasonable calculation, have taken longer than the estimated age of the universe. It was, the Germans believed, unbreakable. They were wrong. The story of how Enigma was broken is the story of genius colliding with desperation, the story of Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman and dozens of other brilliant, strange, remarkable minds, building machines called bombs that could narrow the astronomical range of possibilities down to something a human team could manage. It is a story of captured codebooks from sinking U-boats, sailors risking their lives to board enemy submarines before they sank, grabbing documents from flooding compartments, knowing that the information they were retrieving might save more lives than they could count. It is the story of a Polish intelligence team that had been working on Enigma before the war even began, whose contributions have sometimes been lost in the larger narrative, but without whom the British team might never have found their starting point. The breaking of Enigma was not a single moment of triumph. It was a slow, grinding, agonizing accumulation of insight, setback, breakthrough, and setback again. And when it worked, when the decoded messages began flowing to the naval commanders who needed them, its impact was almost impossible to overstate. Because suddenly, the shadows had faces. Suddenly, the invisible killers in the dark had addresses. Allied convoys could be rerouted around U-boat patrol lines that the submarine commanders believed were undetectable. Allied aircraft could be directed to positions where U-boats were expected to surface. The hunters were becoming the hunted. But they did not yet know it. Back in Washington, Ernest King was reading the intelligence reports with a focus that had shifted from desperation to something more controlled, more purposeful. He was reorganizing the convoy system, implementing the practice of gathering merchant ships into large, escorted groups, protected by destroyers and corvettes, rather than letting them travel individually across the open ocean. He was fighting with the Army Air Forces over the allocation of long-range patrol aircraft, battles that became legendary in their ferocity, as King argued with a passion that bordered on theological that the Atlantic Gap, the zone in the middle of the ocean unreachable by land-based aircraft from either side, had to be closed. The U-boats loved the gap. In the gap, they could operate almost without fear of air attack, surfacing freely, moving quickly, coordinating their wolf pack attacks by radio. The gap had to be closed. King would not stop fighting until it was. It was in this atmosphere of desperate, grinding, slowly turning tide struggle that a young man named James Calloway found himself in the mid-Atlantic on a gray November morning in 1942, standing on the pitching deck of a destroyer escort called the USS Harmon, watching a convoy of 32 merchant ships labor through heavy swells ahead of him. James was 23 years old. He had grown up in rural Georgia, on a farm where the farthest horizon he had ever seen before joining the Navy was the line where the red clay fields met the pine trees, and where the wildest water he had encountered was the creek that ran behind his family's property. The ocean, when he first saw it at training camp in Norfolk, Virginia, had struck him with a force that was almost physical. He had stood at the water's edge and simply stared, trying to make his mind accept a scale that his entire upbringing had not prepared him for. It was one of the most disorienting and one of the most beautiful experiences of his life. Now, a year and a half later, the ocean was no longer beautiful to James in the simple, uncomplicated way it had been that first morning in Norfolk. It was something more complex. It was his workplace, his battlefield, his home, and his greatest source of anxiety, all at once. He had seen what the U-boats could do. He had watched ships burn. He had pulled men from the water, or tried to, because sometimes the men in the water were already beyond pulling. He had learned that the sea takes without sentiment and gives nothing back that it does not choose to give. He had also learned, slowly and imperfectly and through experience that he would never be able to adequately describe to anyone who had not been there, how to fight in this environment. How to read the water. How to interpret the sounds that came through the sonar equipment, the pings and returns and the particular resonance that meant something large and metal was moving beneath the surface. How to calculate an attack run. How to hold himself together when everything around him was coming apart. On that November morning, the convoy James was escorting was carrying fuel, thousands of tons of aviation gasoline desperately needed in North Africa, where Allied forces were engaged in the campaign that would eventually clear the continent of Axis forces and open the door to the invasion of Europe. The fuel had to arrive. James understood this in the way that men in combat understand necessity, not as an abstract strategic concept, but as a physical, immediate, personal reality. If those ships sank, people would die. Not statistics. People. Pilots running out of fuel over the Libyan desert. Soldiers without transport. The cascading, human consequences of supply chain failure at the scale of World War. The sonar operator's voice came through the intercom at 0347 hours, calm and precise in the way that training produces when it has replaced panic with procedure. Contact. Bearing 045. Range 1500 yards. James had the watch. The decision was his. He had approximately 45 seconds to evaluate the contact, determine whether it was a submarine or a thermal layer, the natural temperature variations in the ocean that could produce false sonar returns, call the action, and initiate an attack run before the contact could maneuver into a firing position on the convoy. 45 seconds during which, somewhere beneath the black water off his port bow, a German submarine commander was making his own calculations, and the outcome of both sets of calculations was going to determine whether 32 ships full of aviation fuel reached North Africa or joined the growing graveyard at the bottom of the Atlantic. James picked up the handset. All ahead full. Hard left rudder. Set depth charges for 75 feet. Stand by on the K guns. The destroyer shuddered beneath his feet as the engine surged and the bow swung hard toward the contact. In the spaces below, men who had been sleeping, writing letters, playing cards, and staring at the overhead in the private dark hours of their own thoughts lurched awake, grabbed handrails, and moved to their battle stations with the automatic efficiency of creatures who had been trained and retrained until the response to that particular ship-wide shudder had become as instinctive as breathing. James braced himself against the bridge railing and watched the ocean rush past. He thought about the convoy behind him. He thought about his mother in Georgia, who had sent him a photograph of the creek behind their farm in her last letter, because she knew he liked thinking about it. He thought about the man on the other submarine, and yes, in that moment, in defiance of everything that war requires you to feel about the enemy, he did think of him as a man. A man with his own crew. His own calculations. His own reasons for being in this dark water at 4 in the morning, so far from home. And then the depth charges were dropping, and the ocean was exploding, and there was no more room for thinking. The attack produced what the action report would later describe as a possible kill, an oil slick and debris that could indicate a destroyed submarine, but could also indicate other things, and the fog of war is rarely kind enough to offer certainty. What the attack definitely accomplished was the disruption of a wolf pack coordinated assault that had been building around that convoy for 6 hours. The submarines scattered. The convoy continued. The aviation gasoline arrived in North Africa. Somewhere in that chain of consequence, a pilot made a flight he would not otherwise have made, and lived to talk about it. James never knew any of that. You almost never know, in war, the full trajectory of your actions. You know what you did. You almost never know what it ultimately meant. What James did know, standing on the deck in the gray morning light as the convoy reorganized around him, was that the ocean was still there, enormous and indifferent and magnificent, and that he was still standing on it, and that for today, the ships behind him were still floating. It was not victory. Not yet. But it was something. And in the winter of 1942, something was enough.